Greetings, folks, and welcome back. I hope you've had a lovely weekend. This week, we'll be talking about the Scandinavian influences on English. And there are actually several. Also, as I mentioned last week, this week's talks are going to be a little less technical because the course can't be all technical all the time. There are other facets of language that I think I really want to explore with you. So, the beginning of this little talk is just going to be a quick recap of the history of the British Isles, or the history of the island of Britain, rather, by way of just summarizing the peoples who have lived there over the last couple of millennia, simply because their languages all play into the overall story that we're telling. After that, what I'd like to do is just break down some of the influences that Old Norse has on Old English, specifically in terms of things like place names, sound changes, and specific words that do specific jobs. So I hope you find it interesting, and I hope it's useful. So to start, let's zip back to 450 BC at the latest. Sometime prior to 450 BC, groups of Celtic-speaking peoples inhabited the Isle of Britain. These are the ancestors, of course, of the Welsh, the Cornish, the Breton, linguistically speaking. And for the next 500 years or so, they kind of had the place to themselves. So just to head off any potential New Agey stuff, which frustrates the crap out of me, the Celts were not the ones who made Stonehenge or the burial mounds that dot the British Isles. Those were already there and already old by the time they arrived. And of course, up until Caesar's conquest of Gaul, there was a cultural continuity between the peoples of Britain and the peoples of Ireland on the one hand, and the peoples of what we now call France on the other, because of course the Gauls were also a Celtic-speaking people. So they were part of this overall cultural sphere that really covered most of Europe for a long time, though never with any kind of unity, as I mentioned before. Well, let's flash forward a bit to about 55 BC, when Caesar completes his conquest of the Gauls and brings Gaul into the Roman Empire. And he's standing there on the shores of what would later be called the English Channel, and his ambitions, and you might know this about Caesar, never really cool off. So he decides he's going to try and make a go at it. Now, at this time, it's not as if Rome was ignorant of Britain, and Britain was this isolated island of Celtic cultural purity or any of that nonsense. There were trading relations between Britain and Rome, and had been for a while. There were resources that Britain had that Rome wanted. There were cultural goods that Rome had that particularly the Celtic chieftains valued. In any case, in 54 BC, Caesar launched an expedition across the Channel. He did exact a promise of tribute from the local chieftains in southern Britain. That tribute, of course, was never paid. So this was just an early attempt that he didn't have the muscle to back up. Well, skip forward to AD 43, so the better part of a century, and the Emperor Tiberius launches the full-fledged conquest of Britain. His reason being, at least one of his reasons being, those resources that the Romans wanted, particularly tin, which is used in making bronze. In any case, in 43, the Roman legions overran much of Britain, most of what would later become England, pushing the free areas, back to the Cornish Peninsula, Wales, or what would later be called Wales, and more or less Scotland and a teeny bit of northern England. The frontier would be secured, of course, in the north by Hadrian's Wall a few decades later. And there was another wall further up, the Antonine Wall, not as heavily armed. So there was this buffer zone in southern Scotland between the province of Britannia on the one hand and sort of the barbarian hinterlands on the other. There was this liminal zone between Hadrian's Wall and the Antonine Wall. We're not going to worry about that. It's not important to our story. In any case, when the province of Britannia was established, there were, of course, immediate cultural changes. One was the introduction of the Latin language. Latin, of course, being the language of communication, business, administration, and ultimately of day-to-day interaction in the Roman Empire. This, of course, is why most of the parts of Europe that were part of the Roman Empire speak a Romance language, speak a language that's descended from Latin. But also, the empire did offer a number of benefits. One, of course, was citizenship. Once you were in the Roman Empire, once you were incorporated into Rome, and this is a very interesting facet of the way they worked politically, then you were Roman, and you could potentially go anywhere in the empire. So your horizons were substantially broadened as long as you bought into that Roman narrative. If you don't buy into the narrative, they will kill you, and they're really good at it. But as long as you play the game, you can win. There was also, and I think this is more important for our story, the protection of the legions, who at the time were the best professional army in the world. And I think I can actually say that absolutely. There were no other countries at this time that could field as advanced an army as the Romans could field, and who used such advanced tactics and strategies as the Romans used. Not that there weren't impressive armies out there, there were. The Romans were just very good at that particular thing. But you might ask, protection from what? The answer, of course, is protection from all of those peoples who hadn't bought into the Roman narrative, because a lot of them had weapons, and a lot of those people with weapons had boats, and Britain is an island. More on that later. In the meantime, life moves on in Roman Britain, in Britannia, and things are generally not bad. It's stable. I mean, the empire did have a good run, and the interior of the empire for a number of centuries was a fairly stable place. The frontiers were a little rough, by which I mean there was a lot of warfare, but the interior worked pretty well. Well, in the 4th century, I believe it was around 310, the Emperor Constantine, seeing the political benefits that Christianity had to offer, adopted that as his own religion. And it kind of makes sense. It's a very centralizing religion. It's ideal, really, for imperial rule. So up until then, Christianity had simply been one of many religions in the empire, and despite the persecution narratives that you often hear, the Romans were surprisingly tolerant. There is tons and tons of evidence of them coming across other gods, other cultures, and simply incorporating them into their view. A very clear example, of course, is the fact that the Celts didn't have the same religions that the Romans did, but their gods served similar functions as a lot of the Roman gods, so they just kind of worked them in. They pursued a policy that we call syncretism, where you see similarities and just recognize that these things are close enough. They're just different ways of looking at the same deity. And very often, just out of their common Indo-European history, this did turn out to be true, but they didn't know that. And there were also a number of other religions among the legions as well. Mithraism was very, very popular, for example, among the legionaries. And while there are horror stories about the horrible persecutions of the Christians, they were really all told from the advent of Christianity up until Constantine's conversion, only about 12 years when Christianity was formally persecuted. And a number of those were under Nero, who was a psychopath. But the persecution narrative is, of course, a politically useful one, so it persists. A narrative, of course, doesn't need to be true to be useful. It just has to be catchy. Consider, of course, the number of right-wing Christians in the United States, the most powerful voting bloc in that country, who are still crying persecution while trying to restrict the rights of other people. In any case, the introduction of Christianity to the empire, given, of course, the aggressive expansionist position that is built into Christianity itself, the impulse to convert others, which most religions don't actually have, it spread throughout the empire very quickly, along with the suppression of all other forms of belief. That's when Rome stopped being religiously tolerant. If you want to read a really good book on that part of history, by the way, check out a work, it only came out a few years ago, called The Darkening Age, The Christian Destruction of the Classical World. It's by Catherine Nixie. It's very well sourced, and it covers basically the first few centuries of the expansion of Christianity into what had been the classical world. It's very well sourced, very well documented, and really quite an eye-opening read. Anyways, I'm digressing, as I tend to do. While all this was going on, of course, the empire itself was having some troubles. Constantine also is famous for splitting the empire into east and west, setting up his own capital at the new city of Constantinople, which was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. And from there on in, the Western Empire enters a period of steady decline, and its days are numbered here. In 410, because of pressure on other frontiers and the expense largely involved in maintaining the province of Britain, the legions withdrew. Now you might think that there were people dancing in the streets at this point because the empire was gone and hey, they had streets. But the Roman Britons had this barbarian problem of their own. Their frontiers were under pressure, and they had become accustomed to the protection of that very good, that very efficient professional army, the Roman legions. And with them gone, the British were largely at the mercy of those other peoples who were less culturally advanced, but ultimately more effective as warriors. And at least twice, the British sent embassies to Rome, practically begging for the legions to come back, and the response was more or less, yeah, good luck with that. And this finally brings us around to the Anglo-Saxons, the people who would become the English. Originally, they were mercenaries. That is, according to Bede's Historia Ecclesiastica, the Celtic king Vortigern hired a band of Saxons in exchange for a substantial parcel of land, the Isle of Thanet, that very southeastern tip of the Isle of Britain, to fight for them, or rather with them, against those other Germanic tribes, the Frisians, the Anglians, etc., and the Scots, who at the same time were coming in from Ireland. The Scots were originally the Irish, actually, and they simply took their name with them to Scotland. Scotland means the land of the Irish, and I'm sure the Irish would like their name back, but that's another story. In any case, Bede has it, as I said, in the Historia Ecclesiastica, that two brothers by the name of Hengist and Horsa led a band of Saxons who first began fighting with the Romanized Celts and then turned their support into a full-scale invasion, ultimately conquering all of what had been the province of Britannia and which would subsequently become the land of the English. Now, we need to take this with several grains of salt because Hengist and Horsa both mean horse, and if you've got a guy writing a religious justification for the establishment of a regime using two guys named Horse and Horse, you're looking at a foundation myth. So the historicity of that exact chain of events is at best dubious, but there is no doubt that the Saxons came and the Anglians came and the Celts were ultimately pushed back to the frontiers, the old frontiers of the province of Britannia. This took a couple of generations, and in that couple of generations is the time when the myths of King Arthur arose. We don't know exactly who Arthur was. There are actually a few viable candidates. He seems to have been either a king or a Roman Celtic general or a commander of some kind, a very good field commander, who was able, for the space of a generation or so, to fight the Saxon advance to a halt. And this is effectively the British Celtic heroic age. We'll talk more about this in a couple of classes because it actually does play into the story of English in a really interesting way. For now, though, it's important to note that the invading tribes were pagan and illiterate, so more aggressive, more energetic, but we might say less culturally advanced. They built with wood, for example, whereas the Romans had built with stone. So I'm not just talking about religious or intellectual advancement, I'm talking about concrete stuff. So there was this opposition then between Celtic Britain, which by that time was Christian, and the pagan English. This situation lasted until about the turn of the 6th to the 7th century, when Rome began sending missions. And as I mentioned in the last class, at the same time, there were missions being sent south from the Irish monastery on Iona. So from this point forward, we see literacy creeping into English. And in fact, by the 8th century, England had become one of the great centers of learning in Europe, so much so that when Charlemagne was establishing his monasteries on the continent, he sent to England for monks to help him get set up. So by that time, England had been incorporated into the overall Christian culture of Western Europe. That said, of course, the displaced cultures did have their own influence on the Christian culture of the Europeans. This is largely due to a letter by Pope Gregory the Great, I believe dated to about 601, which gave his monks, particularly his monks who were doing missions among the Anglo-Saxons, instructions to not completely displace all of the rituals and practices of the peoples whom they were trying to convert, but rather to learn their ways, learn their rituals, and simply reinterpret them in light of the ideology that was intended to displace them. And if you'll indulge me in one brief digression, this is how we get a lot of the really interesting elements of Western Christianity. For example, Christmas trees, which are an effigy of Yggdrasil, the world tree. This doesn't necessarily date to Anglo-Saxon England, but the same practice is in play. This is where we get the name Easter for that particular holiday. Eostre was an Anglo-Saxon fertility goddess. So if you've ever wondered what eggs and bunnies have to do with Easter, now you know. And a number of gods and goddesses ended up by that same mechanism, and again, not just in Anglo-Saxon England, being incorporated into the pantheon of saints. And I really do see it as a pantheon. They function largely as lesser gods function in polytheistic mythologies. For example, the Irish saint Bridget began her career as a goddess, particularly a goddess of poetry, law, and beer making. So, you could get a worse portfolio. And there are lots of others in there as well. So the mishmash, the cultural mishmash of European Christianity is actually really, really interesting. But time to move on. We are supposed to be talking about the Vikings, the Norse, and I haven't even mentioned them yet, so how about we do that? The first contact with the Vikings came in the 8th century, toward the end of the 8th century, when they showed up suddenly as raiders from the sea. The reason for their sudden success largely has to do with their capacity for shipbuilding. They made this wonderful technological innovation of having the slats along the side of the ship overlap each other like shingles, which gave their hulls sufficient flexibility to be able to navigate rougher seas than any of the other craft in those waters at that time could do. They, of course, were pagan, so we're back into that conflict between a so-called high culture of Christian peoples and a more barbaric culture of pagans coming into conflict with each other. Only this time, their language is a whole lot closer than the language of the Saxons was, for example, to the Romanized Celts. They begin as raiders, sacking monasteries, taking goods, taking people for the slave trade, which of course was a thriving thing throughout Europe at the time, Christian and non-Christian. That was just a slave-using culture. Later, of course, very much like the Anglo-Saxons, they started staying permanently, particularly in the northeast of England and also in other areas of Scotland and Ireland and on the Isle of Man. But it's that northeast part of England that really concerns us now. That's an area known as the Danelaw, And it's from there that a lot of the linguistic influence of the Norse emanates. But they didn't just settle. Eventually, England became one of the centers of the Scandinavian world. The King Canute, or Latinized Canute, actually had his capital from about 1035 in London, from which he ruled what you might call a Scandinavian empire. It incorporated much of England and other parts of the British Isles and a lot of Scandinavia. And in fact, the Normans, who are the next people we're going to look at, and I'll hold off on them until next week. Norman simply means Northman. The Vikings settled, the Norse settled the area we now call Normandy. And over the course of a few generations, adopted the French language. So when the Normans finally come across the channel to invade England in 1066, what you're largely looking at is an attack of French-speaking Vikings. And this effectively marks the end of the Anglo-Saxon period. And if you want to get a sense of what a catastrophe the beginning of those Viking raids appeared to be and really was to the English, take a look at this passage from the Peterborough manuscript of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle for the year 793. This is the year of the sacking of the monastery at Lindisfarne, the first major monastery to be sacked, and its sister monastery, Jarrow, was sacked the following year. Her waren redde voorbekene komene over northern Humraland, and that folk ermliche breiden, that waren ormete ligerashes, and waren jeseeuwene furen draken on them luft vleugende. All right, you can probably recognize some of those words, and if we were doing this class in person, I would actually have you work through it to show you how alien this language is not. There are a lot of words here that you will recognize once you read through a few differences. Her is here, weren is were. Forebekna means premonitions. So for, as in foreseeing, foresight, and bekna as in beacon. Kumene, come, over. Over is pronounced almost exactly the same. An F between two vowels is pronounced like a V. As I told you last class, there's no V in the Anglo-Saxon alphabet. Northern Humbraland is Northumberland, or Northumbria if you prefer. And that folk, that seven-looking thing is an ancestor of the ampersand. That folk, that people. The next bit is a little harder to read in modern English, but that licha is where we get our suffix like or li. But ormeta just means beyond measure. Or is a prefix indicating an overabundance of, and meta as in to mete out, to measure out. And other things that you might recognize here, yesewana, remember that ya is a past participle marker, so und weren yesewana, and were seen. Sewana is just seen, the past participle. Fyren, fiery or flaming. Drakan, dragons. On, in. Tham, luft. Luft is, of course, the sky. It's related to other words that indicate upwardness, such as lift. And it is also cognate with German Luft, as in Luftwaffe, Air Force. Fleugende, flying. Again, the present participle in Old English is marked with the end or ende suffix rather than the ing suffix. And even if you want to take a look at that word fleugende again, some of you know that the German word for airport is Flughafen. So again, we're looking at cognates with contemporary languages. So you put that all together, and what you have is an entry in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle for the first year in which there's a Viking raid that reads, "In this year dire premonitions came to pass over Northumbria, and terribly frightened that folk. There were lightning strikes beyond measure, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the sky." I've always found that passage fascinating, because the dragons, of course, were a poetic insertion, but it also indicates that this is a culture that believes in dragons. And this is something we want to bear in mind looking back at pre-modern peoples, pre-modern cultures. Their beliefs are very different from ours. Things that we take to be folklore, that we take to be myth, many of them take to be real. Dragons were real to many people in this world, probably most, as were any number of other creatures and not quite human peoples. Demons and devils also fit into that category, as do angels. But yeah, the onset of the Viking Age in England was associated with visions of dragons. It's also worth noting that Anglo-Saxon prose, such as you find in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, tends to be a whole lot simpler than Anglo-Saxon poetry. I read you, of course, The Wanderer last week, and the syntax of that from a learner's point of view, and I can speak to this from experience, is really, really difficult to work through. The syntax of those couple of lines from the Chronicle are not that hard. This is more or less the equivalent, the Old English equivalent of newspaper language, and it's much, much more approachable than the poetry, again, from a learner's point of view. But what influence did Old Norse actually have on English? One obvious one is place names, particularly place names in the Danelaw, and I'll show you a map on the next slide. Place names are really good indicators of what peoples have occupied which places, simply because once the place name becomes a thing itself, its meaning, its etymology becomes secondary, and it just becomes a label. For example, I remember when I was doing my minor in Celtic studies at U of T, one of my professors pointed out that there is a hill somewhere in England called Mount Bentor Hill. Well, mount comes from Latin, mons, meaning mountain. Ben and tor are Celtic words referring respectively to mountain and hill, and of course, hill means hill. So if you translate the whole thing into modern English, it's Mountain Hill Hill. That is, the etymology becomes irrelevant once the sound becomes attached to a place. And this is really useful from the point of view of what you might call linguistic archaeology, digging down through the layers and finding the peoples who have been in various places over time. Well, as far as English place names go, I've given you a couple of columns here of Norse and English place name suffixes. So on the Norse column, we have, for example, by, meaning farm or village, holm, plot, island, thorp, village, thwaite, any isolated piece of land, or toft. I've always loved that one, just a piece of ground. Whereas in English, we have borough or bury, meaning stronghold, ham, homestead, or you can use that simply as home. Then there's ing, which is basically a patronymic. It's used among the Anglo-Saxons in the same way that, say, contemporary Icelanders use sen or son, or the ways that Scots and Irish use mac, which also means son. They're all patronymics. Or the way that the Russians use vich, which incidentally is cognate with the Gaelic mac. There are all kinds of other ones. Field for field, and of course tún for village or town. So these endings indicate the peoples who actually lived there. For example, I have a lot of family in a place in Ontario called Grimsby. Well, Grimsby is a wonderful Norse name. Of course, it's named after Grimsby in England. And B is just village or farm. Grim is a Norse name, so what it means is Grim's farm or Grim's village. Similarly, and maybe you've wondered this yourselves, I had always wondered where the term bylaw comes from. Well, bylaw is just village law. That's it. It comes from Norse. On the other hand, if you want to look at the English ones, well, I wonder how many rich New Yorkers who have expensive summer place in the Hamptons, and Hampton just comes from Hampton, realize that their overpriced summer residences are in a place that just means hometown. Or you might think of, for example, and again, I'm drawing on examples from my own geography simply because they're what come to mind. There's a town in on the border of Essex and Kent counties, which is where I'm from, called Tilbury. Well, Bury, of course, stronghold. Till means good. Tilbury simply means good fortress or good stronghold. Not a bad name for a town. And if you want to see what that looks like on a map, well, here's a map of England that demarcates the Danelaw from the part of England that did not come under Scandinavian rule, basically the part that was maintained by Wessex and Alfred the Great. And you can see the Danelaw just dotted with all of those Norse place names, and such few of them as are not in the Danelaw are very, very close to the border. Of course, I'll be posting the PowerPoint for this separately, so you can take your time and look at it as much as you want. And I would encourage you to do so, because maps are fun. They carry a lot of information, and they all tell stories. Another way to look at the influence of any language on another language is to consider the areas of life in which its vocabulary crossed borders. Now, of course, the Norse, the Vikings, were a seafaring people, so we'd expect a lot of ship words to come into English from Norse, and that's exactly what we see. So we have barda, a beaked ship. We don't use that one anymore, but boatswain, boatman or bosun, is one that we still use. In fact, it's a naval rank. Bot meaning boat, and swain simply meaning young man. Other ones that might be interesting for you to look at, there's of course ha, orlok, and then ha sata, oarsman. Well, okay, sata is related to sit, so literally a ha sata is an orlok sitter. Or if we take a look at other martial words, because of course we would also expect that kind of language to work its way into English, given the nature of the contact that the two peoples had, and also given the nature that gradually that animosity disappeared and they ended up merging into a single people. Well, fun things happen when that occurs as well, but hold on to that one. So we have, for example, ones that you might find interesting, the verb filchian, to marshal a force. This comes from Norse. But also we have in modern English a word to filch, which is a slang word sort of meaning to steal. That comes from filchian as well. So we see the word has gone from that military connotation, that direct military denotation actually, down to something of a much lower social grade. Well, this transformation happened after the Norman invasion, and we'll talk about that process probably next week or the week after. Another one that we still use, of course, is ransack, which simply means house robbery. That is to say, breaking and entering. Another area where we see a fair bit of Norse influence is in law and legal terms. And this stands to reason. The Germanic peoples historically have been a very legalistic people. And in fact, the longest functioning parliaments, the longest continuous functioning parliaments in the world at this moment are the Althings, that is the parliaments, in Iceland and the Faroe Islands, both of which were established in the year 935. That is about 2 generations before the conversion of those places to Christianity. So the oldest functioning parliaments in the world owe nothing to the traditions coming out of the Mediterranean, either the religious traditions coming in through Christianity or the legal traditions coming in through the continuity of Roman jurisprudence. These are their own things. That is, some form of parliamentary rule is and always has been part of the heritage of the Germanic peoples. Other words here that you might find interesting? Well, Wepentake, literally weapon take, which is an administrative district, but of course, a district in which, in times of war, all of the men of fighting age would fight together, so they would take up weapons together. We sometimes still hear people speaking on the campaign trail of the hustings, although that one's gotten to be kind of antiquated now. Still shows up more in American politics than in Canadian politics. But in Canada, we have ridings, which comes from friding, which is just a division. So our legal terminology certainly owes a great deal to Old Norse. Similarly, and how could I actually miss the term lagu, which simply means law? That's where we get our word law, and therefore utlaga, outlaw, someone who is outside the law. On the other hand, if we take a look at just a few other categories here before moving on to a different topic, we have botless, bootless, without remedy. Bot is a remedy. And these other ones here we don't really use anymore, but they certainly were important in Old English. Hamsokna, attacking a house. And that sok is related to sacking as well. Lochchep, that was a fun word too. Loch is related to law. Chep, which is where we get our word cheap, simply means to buy. It's also the etymology of the word chapman, which simply means merchant. That's where that surname comes from. But English didn't just borrow words from Old Norse. In many cases, and in some really fundamental cases, words from Old Norse replaced words from Old English. For example, if we take a look at the columns on the slide you're looking at right now, our word egg comes from Old Norse. It replaced the Old English word I. And our word sister, again from Old Norse, is a replacement of the Old English word swester. I won't run through all of these because, I trust that you can read, but some of them are actually worth looking at. For example, take a look at veker, the word weak, replacing the Old English word walk. This is a very common adjective. Just as the word sister is a very common noun, and egg is a very common noun. These are everyday things. And looking at the parts of life, the areas of life that a particular language influences gives you a really good indication of the ways in which the speakers of both languages interacted. And many of the influences of Old Norse on Old English speak to everyday interactions. So we have, for example, wing, coming from Old Norse wing, which replaces the Old English feathra. Now, we've kept feathra. It simply means feather. It has a reduced meaning, but that's something else I want to talk about probably next week. Other very common things, like, for example, sky. Every culture has a word for sky, so we might wonder why the Old Norse word for sky would replace either of the Old English words for sky, uproder or wolken. Now, in that word wolken, there is, of course, a dialect word, an antiquated dialect word, welken, which means sky. So it hangs on in a dialect usage, but it's not the main word. And I'm not going to answer the question of why that would be right now. I have some ideas, and there are lots of ideas around. I just want to pose the question for the moment. Similarly, take a look at window. I love the etymology of window, simply meaning wind eye. But I also like the etymology of the Old English word it replaces, eithirl, literally eye hole. Now think about that in comparison with the word nostril, which comes from the Old English nostril. That is, your nostrils are literally your nose holes. Old English is a very concrete language, and that is something I really love about it. Now, another way of looking at this is words that both languages have for everyday things will often end up having overlapping meanings when they are incorporated into English as a whole. So, for example, we have taka, which is the Old Norse word for take, and niman, which is the Old English word for take, or an Old English word for take. Well, taka has become our general word for take, whereas niman survives in nimble, dexterous, good at taking things. That is, a thief needs to be nimble. Or we have, for example, the Old Norse word anger, meaning simply anger. And this has become our most common word for that emotion. But the Old English word, wrath, now means an intensified version of anger. That is, it's become more specialized. Other ones that I think are worth looking at, and I don't know if I need to talk about all of these. Maybe, deya, meaning die. Well, stervan, which is where we get our word starve, originally in Old English simply means to die. So, as daya replaces stervan is as the general word for ceasing to be alive, stervan, becoming starve, takes on a more specialized meaning. And this is one of the interesting things, one of the wonderful things about language contact. And we'll see this again with French and Latin and every language with which English comes into contact. And that is the more words you import, the more precise your vocabulary can be, the more you're able to specialize the terms that you use for clear communication. Really, if a word doesn't have a use, it stops being used. So any word that we still use, there's going to be a pragmatic reason for it being there. Moving down, we'll take a look at, for example, ill, which simply means ill or sick, and the Old English word uvel, meaning bad thing. Well, these two originally were synonymous. They were synonymous at the time that the Norse and the English came into contact. But now that evil has become a morally bad thing rather than just any general misfortune or sickness. And I'm sorry when I said ill means sick. It also just simply means bad. I can be, for example, ill-tempered, which is basically me before coffee. Or we have the word brauð, which is where we get our word bread. Well, in Old English, the word for bread is hlaf, which is where we get our word loaf. So again, we see this reduction, but also this specialization of the language. The more words we have coming in, of course, as I said, the more precise our communication can be. And by the way, hlaf is also the root of the word Lord. In Old English, one of the words for Lord is hlavard. That's where the word Lord comes from. And hlavard is literally the giver of loaves. So there's an association of lordship in Old English with sustenance, which I think is quite wonderful. And I guess, as I've talked about all of the words here except kasta and werpan, we may as well address those as well. Kast, of course, meaning to throw, to cast. And werpan, which becomes warp, that's kind of a poetic transformation. Because for warp, we mean bend, don't we? Like if a piece of wood is warped, it's bent. And that seems to come from the throwing of a net. That is, if you throw a net over water, it bends in a particular way before it hits the ground. And that particular kind of bending is what the word warp actually signifies. Now, the comparing of Old Norse and Old English also gives us an interesting way into looking at the respective sounds of the two languages. Particularly, of course, the sound changes involved in Old English, which is our main subject right now. That is, there are some sounds that Old Norse preserved the Proto-Germanic pronunciation of that English didn't. So we have, for example, the sk sound in Old Norse, which in Old English becomes sh. So the word skip in Old Norse and the word ship in Old English are the same word, and they mean that thing that you sail in on the water. Or if we take a look at the Old Norse skirta, this is where we get the modern English word skirt, but it is cognate, that is, it has the same Proto-Germanic root as the Old English word skjorta, which is where we get our word shirt. So skirt and shirt come from the same word. Similarly, the Old Norse word scrub and the English word shrub have a common root in Proto-Germanic, and once again, it's the Norse that preserves the more conservative pronunciation. So we can speak of scrub brush, and this tends to be stuff that we encounter in the wild, in the woods, in the forest, or we can speak of the much more civilized shrub, but they're the same word. Other words in Norse that come into English and are identifiable as Norse because of that SK are sky, skin, skill, skrapa, so scrape, and badask, to bask, literally to bathe oneself. So if you're looking to read etymologies as you're going through words, that SK is a pretty solid giveaway of a Norse origin. Another sound change, which will also maybe help you with etymologies, is the change from the Proto-Germanic g to y, in which case, again, Old Norse is more conservative, maintaining the g, whereas Old English is the one that has changed. So we have the Old Norse word egg and the Old English word I, both with the same root, and it was the Old English that changed it. So egg is the more conservative pronunciation. Similarly, we have, for example, a couple of verbs, geva in Old Norse and jevan in Old English. Well, our word give comes from Old Norse, and we can tell that, even though the words are very, very similar, because we use a hard G. And in that position in Old English, that letter should make a y sound. And again, this is a really common word. There are few verbs more common than to give. And the commonness of so many of the words coming into English from Old Norse addresses the intimacy of the interaction between the two language communities. This, of course, makes a lot of sense given how closely the languages are related. That is, it wasn't that hard for them to understand each other. And on the other hand, this also goes to the specialization of vocabulary items we were talking a few minutes ago. And this applies, by the way, also to wing and feather. If both languages had a word meaning exactly the same thing, there's no reason to maintain them both. And I've actually seen it argued, interestingly, that even though modern English has the largest lexicon in the world, I'm not exaggerating, there are about 800,000 entries in the OED, no other dictionary is that big, that there are no two exact synonyms. Even the closest synonyms have some subtle difference in, if not denotative meaning, the specific thing that they indicate, connotative meaning, the various things that they suggest. So big vocabulary is good. I'm a big fan of a big vocabulary. I should use words other than big to describe that. Going to move on. Now, if we want to look at other sound changes, we can consider the difference between k and ch, in which case, once again, Old Norse maintains the more conservative pronunciation. So we have, for example, in Old Norse, kid, from which we get kid, and we have in Old English, child, from which we get child. These have a common root in Proto-Germanic, or maybe a little more obvious, Old Norse kirkja, from which we get kirk, which is still current in Scottish, for example. The Church of Scotland is actually called the kirk, not the church. And then we have in Old English, kyrkja. These again have the same root. Moving down, we have the Old Norse word diki, meaning ditch or fish pond, and this is where we get our word dike, that is, the wall we put up so that water won't flow through it. And this is cognate with the Old English word ditch, which is that thing you dig so that water will flow along it. Those both have the same etymology. They're both reflexes of the same word. So they have come to be actually literally inversions of each other. One thing you dig and another thing you build, but both having that common association of controlling water. Now, our next sound change is one in which both Old Norse and Old English have varied from the Proto-Germanic root, but varied in different ways. So we have on the Old Norse side, the phoneme I becoming in Old Norse a, whereas in Old English, the phoneme I becomes the phoneme o. So in Old Norse, we have the word nay, and in Old English, we have the word no, which become nay and no, respectively, meaning the same thing, but again, not precisely synonyms because they have different usages. No is the general word, and nay has a more specialized application, largely in a legal context, which is not surprising given where it came from. Similarly, the words heil and hol also have a similar root, and they become, of course, hail and whole, respectively. Hail meaning healthy, and whole meaning entire. Similarly, we have the word in Old Norse, reider, and in Old English, road, both of which have a common root, and the root, by the way, means road. We keep them both, but the Old English is our general word, and the Old Norse version is raid, which of course it already meant in Old Norse. The last sound change that I want to talk to you about is the transformation of the Proto-Germanic au into ea on the part of Old English, while it maintained its older pronunciation in Old Norse. So we have, for example, the Old Norse word laus, which is where we get our word loose. And we have the Old English word less, which is where we get our word less. But I think that's enough about sound changes. It may be time to move on to something a little more grammatical. Now, when we come to the subject of grammar, there are a couple of changes in inflection that we should probably address. One of these is the change in the third person singular verb ending, eth, to s, which comes from the Old Norse, which is a non-vocal R, not really a sound English uses, but that's what Old Norse uses to indicate the third person singular in the verb. So we have, for example, in Old English, geveth, in modern English, gives. Now, this change has to be inferred. It's not written in any Old English manuscript to my knowledge. Because, of course, when the Norse showed up in England, they weren't really into that whole writing things down thing. They learned that from the English. So a lot of our earlier records of the influence of Old Norse on English actually come from Middle English manuscripts that were produced in the areas influenced by the Norse, in the Danelaw mostly. And the eth or es seem to have been in parallel use for a long time. That is, the South remained more conservative in keeping the eth verb ending, whereas the s verb ending, coming out of Norse, as I said, caught on fairly early in the North. And we see this not just in northern and northeastern England, we also see it in Scottish dialect. So in that sense, and this isn't the only sense in which this is true, there's a strong influence, but perhaps belated, by the North on the dialect of the South, which would become standard modern English. That, though, is a story for about 2 weeks from now. The other inflectional change I want to touch upon today is the change in the third person pronoun. And as with that change from eth to es, we're looking at something really intimate here. This is everyday communication. Now, whereas the change from eth to s could be seen as kind of arbitrary, there is certainly a logic to the adopting of Old Norse personal pronouns in the third person and the moving away from Old English personal pronouns in the third person. And that is simply the difficulty of mutual comprehension in two languages that are so similar. And I can remember this when I was learning Old English. The third person pronoun gave me trouble simply because in Old English, they all start with H. So in the feminine, we have heo or hia, whereas in the masculine, we have he. And these are, when you're not reading them, but just listening to them, these can be difficult to distinguish. The difference in the Norse versions that English imports is this is where we get she, sho, that is where we get our word she. We use a sh consonant rather than an H. And in the plural, it's they or them or their. It's a th, again, rather than an H. That difference in pronunciation simplified the system, and it points toward a difficulty in communication that was solved by adopting what the other language was doing. Now, as we move into the last couple of items, we'll be moving away from vocabulary and just into grammar, but very simple grammar. Simple because it's the root of how we commonly speak today. The first item I want to mention is what's called the zero relative. Now, in order to make that clear, I need to define for you what a relative is. English has a number of relative pronouns, that, which, who, whom, whose. So let's take a look at the sentence, the man that I saw yesterday was walking. Now, that I saw yesterday relates to the man. That is, the content of that is the man. This is just standard written English. Or, the man whom I saw yesterday was walking, if you want to look at it as an object pronoun. So, whom I saw yesterday, again, refers to the man or relates to the man. In Old Norse, you don't need to use the relative pronoun. And that's what's called the zero relative. So, the man I saw yesterday was walking. the absence of a relative pronoun in a relative clause, which is standard everyday conversational English we get from Old Norse. Similarly, the book that I'm reading is excellent, or the book I'm reading is excellent, that speech pattern comes directly out of Old Norse. And as long, and this is just me talking to you about writing, as long as the antecedent is clear, then you really don't need a relative pronoun. That is, as long as the previous noun is clearly what you're referring to by the relative clause, then the relative pronoun is pretty much optional. And that's all the zero relative is. Not using a relative pronoun where the strictest rules of grammar suggest that you should. Thank you, Vikings. The final grammatical item I'd like to discuss with you today is called Prepositional Stranding, or often known as the dangling preposition, about which you've probably been corrected by a number of high school teachers and or university professors by this point. And the way it works is like this. By the strictest rules of English grammar, and by the way, these strict rules don't even become rules at all until the 18th century. We'll talk about that in several weeks. Prepositions are not supposed to end a sentence, or prepositions are not supposed to end a clause. And the logic for that is, of course, they are prepositions, before position. That's what the word means. So, therefore, they should be used according to the term that is used to describe them. Now, unfortunately, that term has nothing to do with the English language. As with so many of our terms, it was imported from Latin. Now, in Latin, a preposition cannot end a clause. It must be followed by an object, by a noun or a pronoun. But in English, particularly after contact with the Old Norse, dangling prepositions are common. They use them all the time. The late Old English poets used them. Chaucer used them. Shakespeare used them. They're perfectly good English. Tell your grandmother this. Or tell any grammar Nazi to go back to ancient Rome if that's the way they want to be about their precious English language, because that rule is actually an imposition. Wait, I'm getting ahead of myself. I should probably explain what I mean. So, to be as strict as possible about it, I might say the subject about which we are speaking is grammar. Now, that is as formal as you can get, given what that sentence is actually about. Now, I could rephrase it into more conversational language and say, the subject that we are speaking about is grammar. Well, that we are speaking about is a relative clause, and it ends in a preposition. So, according to the imported rules of Latin, which I really think have no business being in English anyways, it's bad grammar. According to my grandmother, it's bad grammar. Was bad grammar. She died. Or we could even go more Norse on this and throw in a zero relative and still be perfectly clear in our communication. The subject we are speaking about is grammar. Woohoo! Missing pronoun and a dangling preposition. Take that, grammarians! And if you want to make it worse, we might say, where is the person to whom I was speaking? Again, very formal, very clear. Nobody talks like that. We can simply say more conversationally, where is the person I was speaking to? There you're not just ending the clause, but the entire fucking sentence with a preposition. So, thank you, Vikings, for helping us stand up to the hegemony of Latin grammar being imposed upon our beautiful language. And I think I should calm myself down. Or maybe I should just stop talking entirely. After all, I've covered the material. I guess I just wanted to bring some of the energy to a recorded lecture that I usually bring to a classroom. In any case, I hope this was useful for you, and I'll get it edited and posted as soon as I can. I think, given the time management problems I'm having, getting these lectures out by noon on the days that they're due, I might bump that deadline back by a few hours. And I'm not meaning to be lazy. The truth is, and I've spoken to my other colleagues about this, we're all putting in really, really long hours. I was up till 3 o'clock in the morning last night and up again at 9 making lectures. And sometimes just that extra lead time might be useful. I hope that's okay with you. If there are any problems with it, please let me know. In the meantime, I will get you essay topics very soon, and I look forward to talking to you on Friday. Another lecture, of course, will be coming up on Wednesday, hopefully a little earlier than this one, and that will deal largely with word formation strategies in Old English. These are fun. I find them very interesting myself, and I hope you will too. In the meantime, take care, and I look forward to speaking with you on Friday. Bye for now.